Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Tonight, Plymouth's No Place for Hate Committee, along with PACTV, is hosting the Massachusetts State Attorney General's Office and our own Plymouth Police Department on our program, Fighting Hate from Home. This program grew out of an incident that happened this summer in our community, but it speaks to many events that have happened and are happening across our Commonwealth: hate crimes and bias incidents. Tonight, our hope is that we can learn how not only to distinguish these events, but also to acknowledge them and empower others to speak out and report them. We know that when hate crimes and or bias incidents are acted upon, it not only impacts the victim, but the entire community. We also know that they are underreported. So we hope that this program will help to facilitate dialogue regarding racial and social injustice and intolerances, promote community education and awareness of acts associated with hate and bias, and lastly, to minimize and or prevent these acts from happening by sending a message that it will not be tolerated here in our community. This evening, we have with us Amanda Hainsworth, who is our Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division of the Massachusetts Attorney General's Office. Prior to joining the Attorney General's Office, Amanda was a senior litigation associate at Foley Hoag and LLP and a special assistant district attorney at Norfolk County District Attorney's Office and a senior legal assistant at GLBTQ Legal Advocates and Defenders, GLAD. Thank you, Amanda, for partnering with us and presenting us with this information on such an important topic and time. We also have our Chief of Police, Michael Battieri. Chief Michael Battieri has been with a Plymouth police officer since May of 1985, being appointed to the Chief of Police in November 2008. He holds a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in criminal justice from Anna Marie College. He is a graduate of the FBI National Academy and the FBI Law Enforcement Executive Development Program. He is a past president of the New England chapter of the FBI National Academy Associates, Southeastern Massachusetts Police Chiefs Association, and the Plymouth County Police Chiefs Association. He's a leader within the Plymouth County Outreach PCO initiative and the Police Assisted Addiction and Recovery Initiative. Thank you for joining us and for your service to our community. To our participants and audience members, thank you for being here with us this evening. We are live via PACTV and our Facebook page at No Place for Hate. If you do have any questions that you would like addressed during this evening, during this program, please send it to us via Facebook or at npfhchair@gmail. We will answer the respective questions following each segment. We will start with Assistant Attorney General Hainsworth.
Hi, everybody. My name is Amanda Hainsworth. I'm a lawyer and I'm an Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division of the Massachusetts Attorney General's Office. Thanks to the No Place for Hate Committee and for Vedna for inviting me to participate and hosting me this evening on this important topic. I'm excited to be here. So I'm gonna screen share or try to screen share a PowerPoint just to help guide the conversation, because I have a lot of time and so I have a lot of information that I was hoping to get through, and I think it might be helpful. So let me see if I can do it. Okay. Everybody see that okay? Okay, great. So because I have a captive audience, my office likes to start any presentation with just sort of a background on what the Attorney General's Office is, what we do. We have a lot of resources in the office on a lot of different areas. We just want to make sure people know who we are and what we can do. And then I'll spend the vast majority of my time on hate crimes, what they are, what their limitations are, how we go about prosecuting them criminally or civilly, and to give you kind of a sense of what hate crimes look like on the ground in Massachusetts. Okay, so to get started with the basics. So this is the Attorney General for Massachusetts. Her name, for those of you who don't know, is Maura Healey. The Attorney General plays a really important role in Massachusetts. She's the chief lawyer and law enforcement officer for the state. In that capacity, the Attorney General, we in the office wear a lot of different hats. We have a whole section of the office that does nothing but prosecute crimes, similar to a local DA's office. We have a whole section of the office that does nothing but represent state agencies who have been sued. We have a whole section of the office that does nothing but dealing with environmental issues, and another that deals with healthcare. And then there's where I work, which is devoted in a lot of different respects on focusing on how we can protect and advance the rights of people who live in Massachusetts. Okay, so who we serve and how. So we serve anybody in Massachusetts, whether you live here, whether you're a student here, whether you're just passing through. The law makes no doesn't just differentiate between any of those categories, and so we serve everybody just the same. As I said, we also serve state agencies, and we generally sort of advance the public interest. So even if somebody doesn't call us with a complaint, if we see something on the news that we think will harm the economic interests in Massachusetts or may have an impact on people who live here, then we'll take action. And when we take action, we do it in one of 4 different ways. We'll open investigations into potential civil rights violations, including hate crimes. We'll bring enforcement actions, meaning we'll sue civilly or we'll prosecute criminally. We do prevention work, which is sort of what I'm doing now, which is getting out and talking to people about what the law is and what your rights are, making sure people know that we're a resource and can call us whenever something happens. And policy work, which is really sort of anything from putting out guidance on what the law requires or how we view what legal obligations might be, or weighing in on potential legislation or even proposing our own legislation. So we do a lot of different things. It's a big office. The slide's now a little bit obsolete. We have 4 offices that still exist today in Springfield, Worcester, Boston, and New Bedford. All of them are vacant thanks to COVID. So we're virtual. We're totally virtual. If you go to one of our offices, you'll be met with a sign that instructs you to call. Everybody's working, and all of our hotlines are fully staffed, and all of our email boxes are still manned, and so we've just gone virtual. So and if you are somebody who wanted to make an in-person complaint, or you prefer to talk to somebody in person, we'd ask that you do it by phone instead. Okay, so just to focus for a minute on where I work and what we do. I work in the Public Protection and Advocacy Bureau, PPAB. There's a lot of different parts of PPAB. I won't go through them all, but it's the part of the office where our Consumer Protection Division lives, and they do work affirmatively to protect Massachusetts consumers from unfair or deceptive businesses. So, for example, our lawsuit against various e-cigarette companies is run out of that division. We have a division that focuses exclusively on insurance and financial services. So our work around predatory student loans is run out of that division. We have a fair labor division, which does exactly what it sounds like it does, which is focus on protecting Massachusetts workers. And then there's a civil rights division where I work, and we do a whole bunch of different things. This is to give you a sense of the breadth of the work that we do. We do a lot of work on fair housing discrimination. We do a lot of work on disability access, public accommodations. Whenever somebody's discriminated against in any sort of public arena, something that we would investigate and become involved in. Hate crimes, we mostly do civil prosecution of hate crimes out of our division, but we do coordinate with our criminal prosecution arm in the office to address potential criminal prosecution when it rises to that level. Federal initiatives, in the last 4 years, I think anytime there's been any rollback at the federal level of civil rights protections, we're the people who have been suing. And other projects is just, we do a lot of work in schools, we do a lot of work in reproductive rights. None of these things really sort of fit into any of these particular boxes, but really this is just to illustrate to you all that in any of these areas, if you've got a problem or you just have a question, you can pick up the phone and call us, and we can help out. Okay, so that was my opening spiel. On to the main event, hate crimes. So I'm gonna, as I think I said at the outset, that I'm gonna just focus on sort of giving you the basics on what a hate crime is generally. It's actually a relatively limited thing in some respects. So I'll go through sort of the types of things that aren't ever going to be subject to criminal prosecution. And then I'll, give you sort of a sense, like some statistics about what hate crimes look like in Massachusetts right now. And then I'll talk a little bit about how we, at least at the Attorney General's office, go about combating hate crimes and prosecuting them civilly, criminally, and to give a sense of what folks in the community might also be able to do. Okay. So what is a hate crime? So a hate crime is actually not its own crime. It is a crime, usually a crime against a person or a crime against property, like vandalism or assault and battery, that is motivated by bias against a person who's a member of a particular class or group. So it's not itself a hate crime is not itself a crime. It requires first that there be an underlying crime, like an assault and battery or like vandalism, that happens to be motivated, at least in part, by a person's membership in a protected class. It doesn't have to be the only reason. It doesn't even have to be the predominant reason, but it has to be a reason that the crime was committed. So, for example, if there's an assault and battery that was the product of like a bar brawl, it's probably not a hate crime. But if there's an assault and battery that's motivated because somebody is Black or because somebody's gay, that will rise to the level of there being a hate crime. I'm going to talk in a minute briefly about the morass that is hate speech online, and when and how that might rise to the level of being a hate crime. It certainly can involve online activities. So, if you have an instance where somebody is like cyber stalking or harassing or making pretty overt threats, that might rise to the level of constituting a hate crime. But it really can sort of take a variety of different forms. So we as lawyers like to talk about elements of a crime. So to give you a sense of how lawyers are thinking about whether or not something rises to the level of there being a hate crime, there really have to be three things. There has to be that underlying crime. So there has to be that assault and battery. There has to be that vandalism. There has to be a crime. It has to be done with the intent. So the person who's doing it has to intend to intimidate the victim of the crime. And it has to be because that person, because of their religion, their race, their national origin, their sexual orientation, their gender identity, or disability. Those are the classes. There are a lot of other classes out there that you might want to also call out for protection. For example, I'll talk about this in a minute. There's a federal hate crime statute that protects on the basis of gender. We don't have that yet in Massachusetts, but it has to be one of these one of these categories. So hate speech by itself, there's in this day and age, there's a lot of hate speech, and it seems, in my own personal view, to be getting worse and not better. But hate speech and offensive conduct by itself doesn't necessarily violate the law. We get a ton of calls, and with increasing frequency, where people are calling because somebody posted something on social media that was, derogatory, included a racial slur. We get calls about like robocalls around the election that include things that people find to be offensive or inaccurate. But when we're talking about speech, it's very hard to get to the place where it's legally actionable, which makes addressing hate speech, which I think of as the sort of like gangrenous infection that's underneath the hate crime, very, very difficult to address. When we prosecute a hate crime, it's like putting a Band-Aid on like a much bigger problem, but it's very hard to get at the underlying problem. Just to sort of give you a view on how we think of hate speech is generally speech that offends, threatens, insults, intimidates somebody on the basis of their membership in a particular group. The reason why that type of conduct isn't actionable or criminal in the United States and in Massachusetts is because we have the First Amendment, which protects freedom of speech. And the First Amendment does not have an exception for hate speech. First Amendment does have some exceptions, and it doesn't apply equally in all contexts. So, for example, students in schools have diminished constitutional rights, and so there's more freedom to regulate speech in the school environment. And the First Amendment protects. There are exceptions in the First Amendment for things like fighting words, which is actually a legal term that should or is originally conceived to mean any utterance that is like insightful of violence, but actually at this point means it has to literally incite immediate violence for it to be accepted from protection under the First Amendment. Actual threats against a person of imminent harm, that's accepted under the First Amendment. And speech that's part of the commission of a crime. So, for example, if you are posting information about how to commit a crime, bomb making, for example, or if you're engaging in the dissemination of child pornography or something like that, that's of course accepted from protection under the First Amendment. So there are some exceptions. It just doesn't reach hate speech. But like I said at the outset, a successful hate crime prosecution requires the crime itself and then evidence of bias, evidence that it was motivated by animus against a particular person. So if there is that bar brawl that I talked about at the beginning, where somebody was attacked because they're gay or because they're Black, if somebody in the commission of that crime used a racial slur or a derogatory slur towards gay people, that speech could then be used as evidence in court of somebody's bias against a particular person or group. So just because you can't prosecute somebody for saying something offensive, it can supply pretty powerful evidence of bias that's important to a hate crime prosecution. Just to talk about this online, I mean, I think, and I only included this on the next slide because I figure this is the thing that people are sort of most interested in right now, and maybe it's just because we get so many calls about hate speech online. The internet is a real morass, and it's really, there's just not really effective tools in our toolkit right now to address it. Social media, Twitter, there's all sorts. I checked in anticipation of today's presentation. I went to like Storm Runner, one of the like right-wing websites, to see what they were talking about, and it's really, 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 really problematic. And there's just not much that can be done to reach it. So advocacy, community advocacy, both around changing the law and around encouraging these social media platforms like Twitter or Facebook to take action to like censor the conduct or change their terms of use to make it, to create rules that they will then enforce, that limit the ability to have those types of conversations. I think like that's probably the best way to go about tackling the internet right now. But like I said, I mean, there's also all of that stuff can be used as evidence in a hate crime prosecution, but you have to have the crime happen first, and nobody wants the crime to happen first. So some common themes just from my perusal of the right-wing website last night. There's still a lot of Holocaust denials. There's a lot of like anti-Asian American bias related to COVID, lots of domestic extremism, and of course white supremacy. It's a wild, unfortunate world out there. And this like blew my mind when I started this job. And I'm a parent, so it particularly blew my mind. But online gaming is like the new thing in terms of coordinating and planning these sort of like events that might lead to hate crimes or bias related incidents. So for example, so I get not being a particularly tech savvy person myself, I think sort of what ends up happening is that kids go onto these gaming platforms, they start playing with a stranger who they don't know, and then all of a sudden they're being sort of recruited and exposed to conspiracy theories that might lead to lead them down a dark path towards, that might culminate in a hate crime or another sort of incident of that magnitude. One example is Charlottesville. The Charlottesville rally was actually like mostly planned through an online gaming site called Discord, which is a pretty like well-known alt-right gaming platform. And there was a spate of arrests coming out of that platform as well for a potential attack on a Muslim woman in New York. So online gaming is also an area that's fraught. So who commits hate crimes? So I looked at the most recent data in Massachusetts. The data tends to suggest that hate crimes are predominantly committed in Massachusetts by people who are white, people who are male, in between the ages of 16 and 25. There's definitely some like spread on the ages. So people who are older than 25 certainly engage in this conduct as well. But the data sort of concentrates around this profile. There's been a whole bunch of research over the years on what motivates people to commit hate crimes, and to just sort of give you a sense of what those motivations are. Thrill seeking is a big one. The Southern Poverty Law Center. Let's find this like one that I have for myself. So the thrill-seeking perpetrator of hate crimes tends to be, the classic sort of image would be like your drunk, bored, young person marauding around the neighborhood looking for something to do. So we get a ton of calls recently around young kids, destroying or in one instance burning Black Lives Matter signs. I think and they're largely high school students who seem to frankly just be bored, and so I would sort of put that as an example of like a thrill-seeking motivation for hate crime. The Southern Poverty Law Center estimates that 66% of hate crimes in the country are motivated by people who would be who these researchers would describe as thrill-seeking. Defensive hate crimes are hate crimes that are committed in response to a perceived threat against you. Sort of the best example I can think of is the defense, the gay panic defense that existed in the 90s and the early 2000s, where the hate crime was motivated by the like perceived threat posed by the other person's identity. And retaliatory hate crimes are hate crimes that are committed in response to an actual or perceived crime that somebody else has committed. So that's 9/11. That's the anti-Muslim, spate of anti-Muslim hate crimes that happened after 9/11. And then mission offenders, the Southern Poverty Law Center estimates that 1% of hate crimes are committed in the country by mission offenders. I think that number is really on the rise. So these are the folks who like go out with the intent and purpose of committing a hate crime. So hate crimes protections exist at both the federal level and at the state level. The way they function is generally the same. But the federal statute has some different protections. Notably in Massachusetts, the federal hate crime statute protects against hate crimes on the basis of gender, which is not the case in Massachusetts. For other states, the federal hate crime statute is actually really important because a lot of states don't have protections for hate crimes motivated by bias on the basis of sexual orientation or on the basis of gender identity. So it can be really, really important in states that don't have good hate crimes laws on the books that protect all classes. To give you a sense, this recent data from the federal government on the hate crimes that are reported to them nationally, the vast majority of them have been motivated on the basis of race or ethnicity. And actually of that 57.5% number on this slide, half are specifically targeted on the basis of bias against Black people, 20% motivated by religious bias, 17% sexual orientation, 2.4 gender identity, and disability bias. When I put this slide up, I always like to put a caveat on it that not all states have protections that exist for all groups. And so whether or not something is categorized as a hate crime in the first instance, at least in some instances, depends on whether or not the state actually has the protection in the first place. So 2.4% hate crimes motivated by bias against trans people is probably way underreported because that protection doesn't exist in a lot of places. And this is the data from Massachusetts, is most recent data from Massachusetts. So you can see it like largely parrots the federal protections that exist. And again, I think the caveat on any kind of hate crime data is it's really sort of incumbent on the local police department and the prosecutor to identify it as a hate crime, to charge it as a hate crime. And you know, there's unfortunately, you know, I think a lot of local police departments are excellent at identifying them and charging them properly, but there are some that inevitably fall through the cracks. So the data might not actually reflect the true state of affairs. And just, you know, the underlying crime part, these are the sort of most frequent underlying crimes that are committed and charged in the context of a hate crime. So property vandalism crimes, intimidation and assault being the biggest ones that are most likely that underlying crime and the hate crime. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but you know, hate crimes have continued to be fairly high in Massachusetts. There was a big uptick in 2016, then it flattened a little bit in 2018. And then, you know, I don't know what the data is right now, but if my office is any indication, I think they're sort of back up a little bit in terms of bias-related incidents. There's a lot of different theories out there about why they're you know, we've seen a rise and increase in hate crimes. I think, you know, distrust in government and community institutions married with increasingly more hostile rhetoric is certainly a factor that has, I think, led to an increase in hate crimes. I think response to demographic change is the theory that a lot of academics have put forward as motivating bias against immigrants. You know, social media is obviously a huge factor here. I think it's hard to catch up with social media. I think, you know, there's been a lot of news coverage lately around the QAnon conspiracy theory that's been floating around, that hashtag, and you know, there's nothing there to suggest that's like that there's any sort of like hate crime there. QAnon itself hasn't been classified by the Southern Poverty Law Center as a hate group, but you know, to sort of catch up to that and catch it before it sort of disseminates and before they sort of get their buy-in from individual people is really tricky. And then all of a sudden you have this network that's emerged that is captive and that's listening. And I think that certainly contributes to the rise in hate that we've seen more recently. So hate crimes in Massachusetts can be prosecuted, as I said, criminally or civilly. They can be, there's actually 2 different laws in Massachusetts that can be used in a hate crimes prosecution. There is the hate crime formulation that I've been beating throughout this presentation, predicate crime, plus motivation to intimidate somebody on the basis of their membership in a protected class. We also have a statute on the books in Massachusetts that criminalizes civil rights violations. Doesn't necessarily require a showing of bias motivated by against a particular group. But what it does is criminalize interference with a protected right. So, you know, for example, we all have the right to vote in Massachusetts. And so if somebody unlawfully interferes with your right to vote in Massachusetts, that arguably would fit within this statute. As a practical matter, judges in Massachusetts tend to look for there still to be evidence of bias motivating the civil rights violation, but it is a statute that does exist in parallel to the hate crime statute, and particularly when we're thinking about whether or not the evidence is going to be good enough to prosecute a hate crime, this is often, a tool that could also be charged and carries criminal penalties in Massachusetts as well. So we also have in Massachusetts, which is not the case in most other states, a civil statute that allows the Attorney General's office to civilly prosecute hate crimes. It's called the Massachusetts Civil Rights Act, and it basically allows the Attorney General to go into court. Let's pull this out here. And basically file a lawsuit against a person whenever someone has unlawfully interfered by threats, intimidation, or coercion with any protected right. There's no explicit bias component here, but again, as a practical matter, we're looking for there to be some evidence of bias. When we bring a civil lawsuit, it's usually, not always, but usually in parallel to a criminal prosecution. And it adds another layer of protection for the victim of a hate crime. And usually what we'll do is we get an order from a court that prohibits the perpetrator of that crime from, continuing to engage in that conduct, not only against the victim, but just full stop. And, sort of beyond this one particular civil statute we also have a lot of other tools in our toolkit to address discrimination and civil rights violations that happen in Massachusetts. We have statutes that deal specifically with schools. We have statutes that deal specifically with employment. We have statutes that deal specifically with housing. And so we have a lot of tools in our toolkit to address underlying discrimination and bias. And we also have the Massachusetts Civil Rights Act, which allows us to actually go into court when there's been a hate crime or when there's been a civil rights violation to get our own court order to prohibit the conduct from happening again. So just to talk a little bit about the remedy, the court order that we would get if we were to do this, it can take a lot of different forms. We can get protection for the victim and anybody like the victim. We can get an order that's a little bit like a restraining order that tells the perpetrator they have to stay away from the victim, away from the victim's house or their work, or whatever sort of geographic limitations would be appropriate. We can get an order that prohibits any sort of future intimidation or violence. And it's a really important thing, because if the order is then violated, that's something that can be prosecuted criminally, and it also carries some penalties with it as well. So it can be an effective tool. So here's some examples of ways we've used it before. So we've used it to address harassment by neighbors. We've actually just filed 2 cases where one of which was referred from the Boston police that involved neighbor on neighbor harassment, and we didn't get it. We ended up getting a resolution in that case that protected the tenants that were experiencing racial harassment. So it was a good sort of tool to sort of right size that situation. Same thing, harassment by landlords, similar sort of idea and approach. Bias motivated threats and violence, that's sort of when we're going in parallel to a hate crimes prosecution, because we think that the victim needs another layer of protection. And that might be particularly appropriate in a case where a defendant who's been charged with a hate crime is out on bail, and we have some concerns that they might commit another crime or harass another person other than the victim. So it's another layer of protection to make sure that that the conduct is restrained and stopped from happening in the future. And we've also used it to address interference with reproductive health care clinics. So there have been, just not necessarily we think of as a hate crime, but it is something that has been a tool to address other types of intimidation or harassment that impact a person's civil rights. So you have a right to go to a reproductive health care clinic and seek, even if that clinic performs abortions, and to seek the health care that you need, and to be free from harassment while you're doing it. So for a long time there were probably still to this day, but there were a lot of like protest interference happening at abortion clinics. And so we use this tool to temper that down and make sure people could get access to the healthcare that they needed. Civil and criminal prosecution. So most hate crimes are prosecuted by local DA's offices, brought by local, investigated, charged by local police departments, prosecuted by local DA's offices. In some cases, as I said, we will bring our own parallel civil action to get that extra layer of protection. And the types of cases that we do that in are cases where, like I said, we think an additional layer of protection is necessary, or where the commission of the crime was particularly disturbing or had an element of randomness. So we were concerned that it would be something that might repeat itself in other contexts. We've done it in cases where the victim has been a child, and we felt like it was important for the child and for the parents to have an additional layer of protection, and also to have everybody, have local PD, have the local DAs, and have the Attorney General's office all at the table working to protect that family. So there's a lot we can do to be helpful, and we also try to be supportive and helpful of local police departments and local DA's offices to make sure that they're they have the resources they need to recognize and charge these crimes properly. So that's pretty much that. I don't know. I'm happy to have, I'm looking at the organizer now, I'm happy to have this presentation be circulated or whatever, but, or, to circulate the number for our office to call if you have any questions or concerns about bias-related incidents or hate crimes. You can always file a complaint with us online. And these are just some ideas of how communities can engage, and how we try to engage combating hate crimes before they actually become a crime. So we try to do community outreach, get out in the community and do things like this, educate folks on what their rights are. We do a fair bit of training with local police departments and local DA's offices around hate crimes. And as I said, we investigate and bring our own actions. Just wanted to touch on COVID really quickly. We've seen and have continued to see a rise in hate crimes and bias-related incidents that specifically target Asian Americans as a result of COVID. We've been working to address those and to get out information, take aggressive action. We rely on folks like yourself to report incidents to us, either of that type of bias or of any bias, so that we can be aware of it and take action to protect our residents and our immigrant communities. So there's a bunch of resources here at the end that are standard parts of our presentation. But that's essentially the end of my presentation. I feel like I've talked for a long time, and I'm not sure that any of it made sense, so I'm happy to take questions now. If anybody has any.
Thank you, Amanda, for that very, very comprehensive presentation. We do have some questions, and we will start with, so I'll start with acts of bullying. So if there are acts of bullying and harassment that often escalate into like offenses that are more serious, are there any signs of intolerance in our community that may not be crimes, but they could signal like bias that should be monitored?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so when I think of bullying, I'm thinking, I guess I'll say like specifically of students in schools. We get a lot of calls. I myself have 2 active cases with schools involving kids. I think it's actually, in that context, I think even more preferable to get us involved, because I think we have a lot of tools in our toolkit in working with schools and with school administrators to address those conducts short of actually charging a kid with a hate crime. We really don't want to see kids charged with crimes, and so if we can avoid it, we'd rather address the underlying systemic issues. And so certainly I think it's great to monitor those types of incidents. We know, especially with the internet, cyberbullying It's a real problem. And schools have a lot, they have their own bullying and cyberbullying policies that usually reach conduct that happens outside of school hours. So those can all be really effective tools in helping support the school and support the students who are involved in addressing and remedying the conduct before it turns out, before it escalates to the point where we're talking about there being an actual crime that's been committed.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, echoing Bedna, Amanda, thank you very much for that presentation. We do have another question that is more about what can communities do when they are impacted by a hate crime? So you kind of mentioned at the end of your presentation about different ways to get in touch with your office. I wonder if you could elaborate a little more on that, please.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I think alerting people to the issue is, I think, key. And I think it's always better to pick up the phone and call your local police department, call the Attorney General's office, you can even call the DA, call whomever, to let them know that this is something that's happening, that's having an impact on the community, and that you want to see addressed in one way or another. Let them tell you they can't. Let them tell you it's not an issue that's within their purview to respond to. But always, I think, start by letting people know that's something that you're experiencing. And my office, at least, when we get those phone calls, we never send people away empty-handed. So if somebody calls and they have a concern about a particular, the spate of sign burnings, for example, that we've been dealing with, we have a lot of flexibility in how we respond to that. So in that instance, put our thinking caps on and we're like, well, this involves students, maybe we should reach out to the school. Maybe we can see if there's an intervention we can do at that level. Maybe we could do some restorative justice. Maybe there's something we can do to sort of address the conduct in a more creative way. As it escalates, if it becomes something that's like more serious and you actually begin to fear, call your local police department. They'll have resources and they'll be able to guide you in the direction that will give you hopefully some measure of comfort. And also, I think, doing the No Place for Hate committee and just sort of like organizing amongst yourselves and getting the word out and educating your own community, your own neighbors, talking to people, fostering that sense of community, I think can also be a really, really effective tool. But that's just my own personal, 2 cents on the topic.
Thank you. All righty. Another question. So you talked about how communities can, who are impacted, can somehow, gather around or support others who have gone through this or respond to. Do you have examples of communities that have like algorithms for responding to hate crimes or bias incidents?
I don't. I mean, I think it would be really great if that existed, but I don't. I mean, I think we've seen a variety of different types of conduct. We've seen, everything from sort of an overt hate crime that has been charged and properly prosecuted, that we bring our own parallel action, to sort of a situation that really, in almost every respect, just seems to be a bunch of kids who are acting out in ways that are not appropriate. And so I think the specifics of the situation and who's involved, are they kids, are they adults, what's happening, I mean, that's really going to depend on each community and where the community is and what's going on with it within that community. And so I don't know of any algorithm, but I think doing the things that you all are doing right now by just convening this meeting is a really good way of at least getting started at responding.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a question, I guess, even in terms of like when the presentation, when you said that a majority of the people that do commit hate crimes are between the ages of 16 and 25, and their intent is normally towards like thrill seeking. so I guess the question is, you know, even though it's thrill seeking, it does cause harm. And so, I mean, are they prosecuted in the same way?
No, no. I mean, that's a
Okay.
yes. That's just more, I feel like when I've done these presentations, people are often like curious about why people do the things that they do, and like what the story is with hate crimes in particular, because, you know, they occupy this really like pernicious place, is this place of like hatred. So people are often just curious about it. And there's been a lot of research on why people, why people commit crimes generally. There's a whole field, criminology, that's devoted to that. But I think with hate crimes in particular, I think, you know, I included that slide not because those crimes are treated differently. They're
Okay.
definitely not at all. But, you know, to give you a sense of why people might engage in that type of conduct.
Okay. I think because more often than not, a lot of times, you know, you hear this statement, it was just a kid.
Right.
But then when you begin to see data that suggests that it's a particular group, then you kind of, it's more weighted in a sense.
Yeah, and a caveat about the data is there are you know, the executive office, I always get the acronym for public safety, EOPS, in Massachusetts puts out annual reports on hate crimes that include a lot of this data. And if you look at the data, there's a bunch of graphs that I wanted to include, but I couldn't screenshot because I'm not tech savvy. But what it would show you is on the age piece, there's a spread. You know, it's just concentrated in that area. Women also commit hate crimes, not just men, and other races do too. It's just that's where the data sort of like concentrates. And I think it's tricky because it's also it's as with any crime. Sometimes it is a kid just being a kid, and they're like seeing what they saw on TV, or they're hearing, you know, the highest echelons of government say things, and it spurns them to act. And sometimes it's not just a kid, you know, like Dylan Roof in Charleston, you know, it is actually somebody who has gone out to commit a hate crime. So I certainly, by including the data, don't mean to generalize. And when I use examples of kids who are being kids, I use that more as an example to suggest that sometimes there are interventions that we can do that actually do change and do actually produce like a positive result for the community, short of a criminal prosecution. But sometimes you have a kid that's just, you know, out to commit a crime, and that kid needs to be treated the same way as we would be, you know, as we would be addressing other criminal conduct in other contexts.
Thank you.
Amanda, we do have another question that just came in, and that is, who does the state consider a protected group?
So it's a great question. It actually, you know, as somebody who like does discrimination work for a living, it depends on the statute. So there's a lot of, you know, what's protected in the housing statutes, not necessarily what's protected in the employment statute. In the hate crime statute, it's race, color, national origin. See if I can do it from memory. Sexual orientation, gender identity, and disability. I think that's I think those are the categories.
And let me see, we do have another question as well. Is there a mandate of hate crime data collection or hate crime training for law enforcement personnel?
Oh, that's a good question. Hate crime data is collected in Massachusetts, and it is collected at the federal level as well. And I'll just like put my little asterisk on that data, is that it's data that's collected and reported by law enforcement. And like I said, I think our law enforcement here in Massachusetts are really great, but it really depends on the hate crime being recognized as a hate crime. And so even though we collect data on hate crimes that are committed in Massachusetts, my own view is that is probably underreported data and doesn't sort of give you the full view. And it also reflects the type of conduct that actually gets brought into the criminal justice system. There's a whole bunch of other bias-related incidents for all the reasons we talked about that don't actually end up being charged at all, and so might not make its way into the data. So data collection when we're talking about hate crimes and bias-related incidents is really, really, really hard to give you an accurate sense of what is actually happening. And I'll tell you, the data that we collect in Massachusetts does not really map onto my own lived experience in terms of the phone calls that we get in Massachusetts. So yes, we do collect it. It does exist. I do think it gives you like some insight into what's happening, but it's just some insight. And as far as training for law enforcement, I'm looking at the chief and I'm wondering if he knows the answer to the question. I know that we have done training for law enforcement on hate crimes, but I don't know if it's a mandated part of their training.
Yeah, do you want me to try to answer that now, Ben, or wait?
We can wait.
I saw like
you can answer. You can answer it. But I do want to ask, why do you think it's? We can wait. Why do you think hate crimes are underreported?
I think it's hard to so it has to be reported in the first place. So somebody has to pick up the phone and they have to call, and the person that they call has to recognize it as a hate crime and not just an assault and battery. And often, unfortunately, I mean, even the best police officers are going to miss that. Sometimes they're not going to catch that it's motivated by bias. And so I think, there's a lot of different ways that it can go, and and then it goes on to the DA's office, and maybe they see it, maybe they don't. So I think it's self-reported data, and so I think that's sort of the thing to keep in mind about it. And it doesn't, as I said, it doesn't touch anything that doesn't actually make its way to the police department. So I think we always try to do whatever we can, and I know the local police departments do as well, to make sure that none of those crimes are falling through the cracks. But it's hard. And I also think that the hate crimes, this is like my own personal view, the hate crime statutes in Massachusetts are confusing, and there's 2 of them, and there's and not all protected categories that that we would see protected in other discrimination contexts are included in that statute. So so it just can be hard. It's just sort of the only way I know how to answer the question. It's complicated.
No, thank you.
We have another kind of data point question, a little bit different, but wondering if you have an idea of how many hate groups exist here in Massachusetts, and maybe too, if you could touch on what might constitute a hate group.
I have no idea how many hate groups exist in Massachusetts, and I sort of personally generally don't think anybody has a handle on how many hate groups currently exist anywhere, including in Massachusetts. The Southern Poverty Law Center, if you're curious, you can go on their website. They have a whole sort of roster of groups that they've deemed to have met their threshold for what would constitute a hate group. So I have sort of no sort of idea orders of magnitude how sort of much of a presence they are in Massachusetts. But I also think my caveat on that would be is the internet is the internet, and so whether or not something meets the threshold of a hate group like the Ku Klux Klan, the message is still getting out there, and people are still hearing it, and young kids are still hearing it, and so and there was a second part to the question that I think I've now forgotten. So
yeah, just wondering what constitutes a hate group. It sounds like there may not be an actual legal definition for that.
There's not one that I'm aware of. That doesn't mean that's not the case. I mean, I think the federal government also does a lot of sort of like, or at least they used to do a lot of tracking of hate groups across the country as well. So that they very well may have their own sort of criteria for how they keep an eye on that. But and just because I'm not aware of it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. But I'm personally not aware of it.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. Ben, you're muted.
I'm sorry. I guess just one or two more questions. So should
Sure.
someone report a suspected hate crime to the local police, the AG's office, or both?
I mean, I think you definitely report to the local police department, and you should also, I think, report it to the AG's office, because I actually had one case recently where they reported it to the police department, and it was sort of unclear who the perpetrator was. It was a bad hate crime, but it was just sort of unclear. So the police department investigated and ended up identifying the perpetrator. But during that time, the victim was really just sort of like antsy and wanted to, feel like something was actually happening. So they also called us, and so we were able to coordinate with the local police department. And then, we've sort of continued to support the prosecutor in that case, and have been in touch and have so I think sometimes it's just helpful to like have everybody at the table and talking and coordinating, and also for those same reasons, we really like to collaborate with our law enforcement partners. So, sometimes we won't bring a civil enforcement action because it might complicate the criminal prosecution, but sometimes you're gonna say, that's actually a really helpful thing. Can you do that? So, so it's a roundabout way of saying I would recommend calling everybody. And I certainly think my general mantra is make them tell you no. And so to that end, I think, there's never any harm in calling.
Thank you.
Amanda, I think we have one more question that's come in for you, and then we'll give you a break. Thank you for answering all of these. This one is more thinking forward and thinking in the future. If there's anything that people should be aware of in terms of any policy changes or updates in the process of reporting that might be coming along soon, just if there's anything people should be keeping an eye out for to learn in the future that your office might be doing.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think so certainly we're always happy to do trainings like this one. I think there's nothing sort of like actively from a policy perspective on the table right now with respect to hate crimes, but it's certainly something in this climate that's been the subject of discussion. And so I would pay sort of close attention to what happens legislatively, because I wouldn't be surprised if in the next year or so there's a legislative effort to revamp the hate crime statutes in Massachusetts, and I think that would probably generally be a good thing for everybody who's involved in trying to combat it.
Thank you. That's good to know.
Yeah. Thank you again. Thank you very much, Amanda, for joining us. And we will go ahead with just the presentation on our Plymouth PD side. So we welcome Chief Botieri.
Thank you, Ben. I appreciate that. And I'd like to thank everyone for including me in this important training. And the Assistant Attorney General did a phenomenal job. She really answered most of the questions. There shouldn't be much left for me. So as far as the definition, I think she did a great job. I think everyone should understand exactly where it's at. I would just highlight, and I think she did as well, that it's the motivation is the piece. That's the key. And that's the most difficult element that we have. Obviously, there has to be a crime, as she mentioned, but that motivation piece is difficult for us, and it's a constant work in progress. I want to talk a little bit about what happens here locally. So a case would come forward here, and what we do is the Uniform Division would typically respond to that call, and then through a vetting process to our Detective Division. If we believe anywhere along the way that there's some type of bias involved or some type of hate crime or something that makes us feel that that's even a possibility internally within our department, we're going to designate that as a hate crime or bias investigation. What that means is it'll be a detective or two assigned to that case to try to make sure we cover all our bases, whether it's videotape, interviews with people that this person was with prior. And I think what can I call you Amanda instead of Attorney General? What Amanda mentioned in her presentation was words do matter, and words really matter when it comes to this type of a crime. The motivation piece and the ability to use words that were said prior to the assault or the property damage or the threat are real important to us, because it puts it in that perspective for us. Without that, we're kind of having a real difficult time unless we have specific words said at a scene by the suspect. So I just want to highlight that piece. I want to talk a little bit about what can be done to help us, and I think help us prosecute a case successfully. And that's just all the information that you can give us as far as other people that were in the area, anything that you witnessed, any type of plate number or vehicle, or if you know this person and they have prior associates that we can talk to, because that's all important to us when it comes to that point. So let's say that a case, an investigation is deemed a bias investigation. Now, as Amanda mentioned, a lot of those don't end up in prosecution. A lot of those don't end up in even making an arrest. Now, and some of those will end up with an arrest, but not a hate crime charge being brought forward. Maybe just a vandalism or an assault and battery, because we can't put together that element of motive. So as that goes through that system, there's a reporting piece to this. And Governor Baker, established an initiative and implemented an initiative a few years ago where each police department would designate a specific officer. In our case, it's a detective. And that detective is the conduit and the connection to the state for reporting. Now, when we first did that, a couple of 2 or 3 years ago, it was an actual form. It was antiquated. You'd fax it in, they'd collect the data, the state would have it. And then it would go to the Fusion Center, which is a state police run area where they collect a lot of information, whether it's, potential threat for a special event or bias crimes or those type of things. And they would collect it there. Now, in the last couple of years, it's been determined that we report all of this through what we call the NIBRS, National Incident-Based Reporting System, which all police departments participate in. So we'll designate that investigation as a hate crime. And what will happen is now, once we designate that and send it in to the federal government, it ends up back at the Fusion Center for vetting. Now, we, on all cases, it seems like we always get a call down in our records division from someone from the Fusion Center saying, it looks like you designate this as a bias crime or a bias investigation. Can you tell us a little bit about it? Because we want to make sure our data is good. So we want to make sure that that it is an actual investigation and it somehow could be, there's a reason to believe it could be a bias crime. So we'll do that. And that's kind of how the process works here. I know that over the last year, we've had a few incidents, and it's unfortunate, and we hate to see them. But I do want to say that we will not tolerate any behavior like that. If we have a case that has to be prosecuted, we're going to prosecute that case. And I know there's been some frustration among citizens, and I think the frustration lies in that element of motivation, in the fact that we have to kind of check that box. And I think Amanda knows what I'm talking about. And that's a difficult box to check sometimes. So we need help with that. But I know there's frustration out there, and I want people to know that it's not that we're not trying. It's just that we have specific, areas that we have to cover when it comes to elements. Now, we'll reach out to our district attorney. Most recent case that we're still investigating, so I won't get too deep into it, but we had a case in Plymouth where I think the public and a lot of the people on different committees felt that it's obviously a hate crime. Well, I mean, that's not an element. We need to still hit those elements. But what we do is we'll vet that through our district attorney, and our district attorney is willing to look over our cases, give us some advice, see if we can close some gaps or there's holes that we should fill. And at the same time, we'll ask them to have that case go. We did in this case, not just to the local district assistant district attorneys, but it shouldn't surprise us that the Plymouth County District Attorney has a specialist and an ADA that specifically does these cases, because the more you do these cases, the better you'll get at them. So we'll vet it through them, and we did in this case, and we just falling short of being able to prosecute for that specific charge, connecting the bias and the hate crime piece. We did charge someone in that case with specifically a vandalism type of a charge, those type of charges, but weren't able to do that. So that just highlights to me how important these type of venues are, because we can get that information out there, and I don't want people to misread the fact that we don't charge and think maybe we don't care, because it's just so far from the truth. We do care, and we work hard to do that. So that being said, I'll talk a little bit about, I want to just talk a little more about the underreporting. I think Amanda's 100% right in that. And I think the underreporting goes even further. I think what we were talking about is underreporting, where someone reports a vandalism or an assault or a threat, but doesn't understand or doesn't have the basic knowledge that it might be motivated by some type of a group that they belong to. So that will not be identified because the victim themselves don't bring that up to us. I actually think it's underreported where some of those crimes aren't reported at all. I think there's basically maybe a threat that happens or some type of an incident where people are treated poorly and they don't even report the crime. Yeah, and in those cases, we don't even know there was a crime, never mind whether it was biased or not. So kind of on the underreporting piece. So I wanted to make sure you understood kind of how it went through here, how the reporting went, where those reports went and how they were collected. And the last thing that actually already came up, and I had it down in my notes to talk about, is the training piece. So the Attorney General's office does offer training. Our offices here have participated in that. A lot of the training that we do is through the Attorney General's office that goes to the local district attorney. And it's kind of co-sponsored by both groups. So our detective division, obviously they're going to get the long-term investigation, whereas the uniform division take the initial call. So we make sure that they're trained, specifically trained in bias investigations. The other arm of that is the Municipal Police Training Committee under the EOPS, Executive Office of Public Safety and Securities. So I'm actually on the committee, the Governor Baker appointment for the Southeastern Mass District, 120 communities. And we meet monthly and we decide what's that mandatory reporting, what's that mandatory training going to look like every year for in-service officers, as well as what's that recruit academy going to look like and what's an important thing. What do we want that recruit to come out and understand and know and be ready to do? One example would be not a hate crime, but the overdoses and the substance use disorder we've seen. Now, when we have an officer come out of a police academy, they're completely trained in the use of Narcan. So that's just an example. We look for what do we need this officer to know when they come out. So years ago, we've identified that bias training is important, and it's been instilled into the basic recruit academy at times. They basically come out with a basic. They're not going to be proven investigators, but they're going to have an idea of what to look for. We want that in those recruits. Now, the other piece that the Municipal Police Training Committee are charged with is identifying mandatory training yearly for in-service officers, veteran in-service. We have 40 hours that by statute we have to provide for every officer in the Commonwealth. And what we'll do is we have several openings and several of those slots are taken by, firearms and specific defensive tactics and update on law update, legal update. But we have several blocks that we're able to plug what's the most important new situation we want veteran officers to really be trained in. And, bias crimes and hate crimes has been one of those several times over the last few years. So veteran officers are seeing those trainings and that's available to them. So it's not just my department, it's actually throughout the Commonwealth. And we have a group of chiefs and representatives from the AG's office. There's a representative, Jim O'Brien's on the committee, sits there with us. And when we have representatives from the state police, Boston police, and all the academies throughout the Commonwealth. So when we leave there and we come up with and vote on and identify what that training is going to look like, it's mandated training for the entire Commonwealth, all the officers. So those are the points I wanted to touch on. I think everything else has been really covered very clearly by Amanda's PowerPoint presentation. So if there's any questions, I would entertain those.
Thank you very much, Chief Lettieri. We do have some questions.
No questions, really?
No. We do have questions. So you did mention the training, which is good. That was a question that was answered. Is the victim's perception of intent of the incident taken into account?
The victim's perception?
Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, so it's a good question. The victim's perception of it will really push it towards whether we investigate it as a bias crime or not. And that's really important to us because if they come in and they have that knowledge ahead of time, I was assaulted down at a bar and I believe it's based on my race. Okay, so right then that's going to tell us somehow there's some information that we take as inherently truthful from a victim, but we then have to back it up by proving it. So we'll be asking specific questions as to why do you believe that? It can't be simply because I'm Black and the person punched me. It's got to be what makes you think that. And that's why I think what Amanda mentioned, and I've mentioned a couple of times, is that those words do matter because in a lot of these cases, really, that's all we have. the people don't really, you know, put up a lot of flags, and they're very cautious when they do these type of things. Now, they might talk to friends, and if we get really seasoned investigators and we really dig in the weeds and talk to people that know them and get some proof that makes us believe that there's probable cause it's a hate crime, we're going to charge that all the time. So 100%, it's important, and it really puts us on the path. The victim's perception puts us on the path of that bias investigation. It still has to be vetted, and it still has to be proven, at least to the probable cause level.
Thank you.
I have a question here. Does the department have a hate crime prevention plan or program such as community outreach?
We don't have a specific program. I mean, we're open to these type of venues. We're open to detectives have done things in the schools, you know, when they're in session, obviously. But we have 4 school resource officers that we make sure understand this, because as Amanda mentioned, these things do happen in the schools. So we don't have a specific program that's done on a monthly basis or anything like that. But we're prepared to present in you know, at any type of a venue or a presentation where people want information.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thanks. Another question. One moment. Oh, my goodness. Sorry. How can law enforcement help hate crime victims deal with the effects that they experience from being victims?
Well, I think it's for us in law enforcement, it's a little outside of our wheelhouse, but I think that what we do in our programs is we offer connection to some type of care or connection to some type of resource. So we have resources that the Attorney General sends out of different places that people can get support and those type of things. So we're always ready to pass that on. It is a little bit outside of what we do, but we definitely have a part of our program is to point them in the right direction so they can get assistance. We would reach out, you know, to you as well. The No Place for Hate Committee. We have a good rapport with you people. If we had someone or you had someone, we'd reach out to you and say, geez, can you help us, you know, help this person and give them some support. So I think it's our relationships and the partnerships that we've grown, not just with No Place for Hate, but with other groups in the community. And that connection is important when it comes to giving people support.
Thank you very much.
Another question, is there any information about hate crimes on the Plymouth Police Department website?
You know, I don't believe there's anything direct on there. I believe, let me think for a second, because we've updated the website recently, and I think there are some links. I think there's a link to the Attorney General's office, which would link you to some of the information that Amanda gave you. So that's probably on there as a link, but it's worth me taking a look and seeing if I can increase that and maybe make some better connections.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
And just, I guess one more question. It was more on how do you identify like messaging that signifies like a threat to you or your family members? If it's anonymous, you know, do you notify police? And so like, how is that kind of, I guess, looked at in a sense?
Well, I think that it was mentioned earlier as well that, you know, we want to know anything that someone perceives to be a threat or something that's precipitated based on a protected group. We want to know every time. And we're fine with notifying the police, notifying the Attorney General's office. That all works for us. But I guess I would just say it's the perception of the person. And if a person feels they've been victimized and it's by some type of social media, whether it's anonymous or not, we want to know about it. And I think I keep referring back to Amanda, but she said so many good things. As Amanda said, I mean, report it and let the police or the AG's office say, look, we've gone as far as we can. We can't do anything. So we really want to encourage that reporting. So it's how the victim feels. If the victim feels intimidated in any way, we want to know about that. And we'll do the best we can to investigate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We're actually done with our question. So I will patch this off to Sarah.
Yes, we'll go ahead and wrap up here, as we want to be respectful of our speakers' time this evening, as well as the PACTV crew, who have also been very generous of their time in filming this tonight and live streaming it for us to our community. Thank you again to both you, Amanda, and Chief Buttieri for joining us tonight on really an important topic to Plymouth, especially during this time. And our community is a designated No Place for Hate community. So we do hope that this has been useful for folks to know how to respond should an incident occur. And we plan to continue using this recording across community groups, schools, any other folks who would like to access it. We will be sharing this recording on our social media channels and on our website, which is PlymouthNoPlaceForHate.org. Also, just want to say that the Plymouth No Place for Hate Committee meets monthly, currently on Zoom, and you can find out meeting information on our website that I just mentioned, or the Town of Plymouth website, or our Facebook page. Everyone is welcome to join our meetings. We welcome all. Thank you again for your engagement tonight. Have a good rest of your night. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you so much.
Nice to
Thank
meet you,
you.
Amanda. Nice job. Well
Nice to
done.
meet you.